is that the medical industry for the last and its activities over the last 100 years have been so hopelessly corrupt. And so this press conference is on the subject of death merchants, how the American medical business has betrayed us all and made a lot of people rich along the way. I'm going to give a historical perspective, but I want to start with the magnitude of the problem today. Medical errors or more. It's a peer-reviewed study from Johns Hopkins University. The study found that iatrogenic illness, which is also actually kills you, that in America, behind only heart disease, is the minimum number. If you go into other studies on the 300,000 deaths every errors. That includes doctors that prescribe surgery, doctors that botch a treatment in medicine. This is the scope that kills 250 to 300,000 people every year. Be trusted to issue mandates that control the lives of every into ever-widening age. The business is now preying upon the most elderly who are being bombarded with even nursing homes. Vaccines are being administered. Have recently been approved. Is in the works for 2 to 5-year-old children to be now, and then that the vaccine context, because it preys upon the old, the very of society. The turn of the century toward the end is that doctors routinely sexually. The condition was called emotional on her uterus, which is a crude and vulgar thing to do, but that's what the doctors did. And how would they treat so-called than to have an orgasm? They would use their fingers, and in some cases they would and did not even hysteria. This was the so by which patient and is more I think of to along moving from the let's go to the mid-century of care was often combined with Freudian 1950s and the 1960s. Tens of thousands If a child on Ritalin, or much worse, upon husbands, what it involves brain for many of the lobotomized. This was still occurring as recently as the 60s, that a psychiatrist could recommend surgery on your brain. And it's not like that's changed, by the way. If we maintain our focus for a moment on the field of mental health, although lobotomies are no longer used, the treatment of mental health is truly no better than barbarism. We see that with the closing of the institutions, the deinstitutionalization of the 80s, while that may have been done with good motives to empower people with mental illnesses, what actually happened was they were dumped on the streets with no support systems and put onto lifelong courses of psychiatric medication, because the 80s and the 90s were the heyday of the SSRIs. That's when Ritalin came into widespread use, and Adderall and all the other psychiatric treatments that continue to dominate the field today. Those can be traced back to deinstitutionalization, when people who had been living in mental facilities were dumped onto the streets with no support, given drugs, and that was considered the standard of care. Now, moving beyond the field of mental health, let's look at the swine flu hoax of 1976. And I think as I describe this, it's going to sound quite familiar to many of you. In 1976, there was a massive fear campaign on television, radio, newspapers, magazines about the dangers of a swine flu virus. Now, the virus had not actually come to America at that time, but medical authorities were in a frenzy that this could be the next big pandemic. As a result, an experimental vaccine was rushed to market. Tens of millions of doses, in fact, somewhere between 30 and 40 million doses of the experimental swine flu vaccine were administered. The deaths started pouring in, and so did the neurological damage. The difference between 1976 and today is that at that time, the government backed down, stopped pushing the vaccines, acknowledged the massive trail of deaths and neurological damage, whereas today, the vaccines that we see are causing unprecedented levels of death and disability, and yet the government pushes onward. So between 1976 and 2021, what changed? The answer is quite simple. It's known as regulatory capture. This refers to the phenomenon by which the organizations that are meant to be regulated actually take control over the regulators. That's the difference. In 1976, once it became clear that the experimental vaccine didn't work, the government dropped the push for the shots. Today, the government serves as the marketing arm for Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. When the government says the vaccines are highly safe and highly effective, neither of those statements has been proven scientifically. Those are both marketing or advertising statements. And that is what has changed. What's also changed is the sheer amount of money involved. When you look back to 2019, Pfizer took in $50 billion of revenue. When you look at 2021, Pfizer is projected to take in $80 billion of revenue. $50 billion was not enough for these people. $80 billion won't be either. That's what's changed since 1976. In 1976, they had the same factors we have today. They had an overhyped virus that was not nearly as lethal as they said. They had experimental vaccines that turned out to be dangerous, and they had government and medical companies working together to push the shots. But the difference now is nobody's putting the brakes on, even as these injections are proving to be even more dangerous than the swine flu injections of 1976. And this speaks to a broader trend, though, in which medical authorities conceal side effects for as long as they can. And this is perverse, by the way, because in line with the oath to do no harm, anybody who works in the medical field, any doctor, duty is not to harm, but rather to heal. But so many of them now seem to have adopted a new priority of massaging the narrative, manipulating the facts that the public gets to see. And that trend, while it happened in 1976, not as badly as it's happening today, that trend can actually be traced back to the 50s. In the 50s, thalidomide was widely prescribed among pregnant women. Thalidomide ended up causing horrific birth defects in those babies, causing them to have stumps for arms and legs and permanently crippling their growth. That's what thalidomide did. It took many years for the regulatory approval to finally be revoked from thalidomide. And that is therefore a history of government cover-up of damaging side effects from trendy medical treatments. You have thalidomide from the 50s. You have the swine flu vaccines from the 70s. You have the mental health drugs of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And you have the COVID vaccines of today. It's one continuous stream of hoaxes and exaggerations and fear-based marketing. And what's really happening is that our existing medical infrastructure operates as a cartel. When you look at the definition of a cartel, it's an organization that does business in such a way that they police their boundaries. You only get to participate if you're a member of the cartel, and the other distinguishing feature is they use violence to maintain their control. That's what the medical business is now doing. They police their boundaries through a long and inexorable sort of medical schooling process that really amounts to an extended hazing ritual involving sleep deprivation, which is classified as a form of torture. So they actually torture the newly initiated med students and doctors as they inculcate them into the biomedical assumptions of our dominant pharmaceutically driven model. That's how doctors are made, through a sort of long hazing process. And if you don't go through that process, you don't get to call yourself a doctor. So that's the policing of the boundaries. The way in which the government has been mobilized for these mandates also lends to the medical business the force element of a cartel, because by marshaling government resources to coerce people into using their products, this is a form of violence. While authorities may not yet be holding people down and forcibly injecting them, they're basically doing everything up to that point that they can get away with. And so the medical business is inarguably a cartel. It polices its boundaries and it uses violence to force the consumption of its products and to maintain its existing way of doing business. So this is why I condemn the system. Some would say, aren't you being too sweeping? Aren't there good doctors? Isn't it just some bad apples in the bunch? No, the whole system has failed. If the whole system had not failed, you would not have this avalanche of vaccine mandates and other abuses ricocheting around the world, including, by the way, the suppression of drugs that are proven to work for COVID, most notably ivermectin, but also hydroxychloroquine and Z-Pak, the Zelenko protocol. The fact that the medical business has actively mocked and attacked and sought to suppress cheap, effective, off-patent treatments shows that they are operating as a criminal enterprise. They may call themselves doctors, but they're operating as a criminal enterprise, keeping life-saving treatments from the people. Think back to when the FDA insultingly tweeted, "You are not a horse. Don't take ivermectin," ignoring the fact that more than 500 million doses of ivermectin have been distributed to human beings over many decades, and that the discoverer of ivermectin won the Nobel Prize because it is such a powerful drug. Now, one of the ways that the vaccine mandate gets pushed is with this claim that even if you've already had COVID, you could get reinfected and spread it to other people. This claim has zero evidence, and in fact, this is some breaking news. A Freedom of Information request was finally answered by the Department of Health and Human Services, and the CDC is part of that. All of our medical regulators are part of HHS. Here's what HHS had to admit in response to a Freedom of Information request. It took them 2 months to get back on it, by the way. What they said was they do not have a single documented case of a person who previously had COVID, catching it again, and then spreading it. There's not one documented case of reinfection leading to spread. So that's one of the leading rationales to push people who already had COVID to get vaccinated. Well, you might get it again. Turns out there's no data to support that in the entire government apparatus. So they're making stuff up. Another lie that medical regulators have been spreading is that natural immunity is inferior to vaccine immunity. That's an obvious lie. A recent study, which was reported in New York Times and elsewhere, found that natural immunity generally lasts about 16 months. Well, guys, the vaccines only last 6 months. Otherwise, you wouldn't need a booster every 6 months, now would you? So what do you think is better? A 16-month natural immunity that doesn't make Pfizer rich, or a 6-month immune system subscription service that does make Pfizer rich? The choice is clear. Between the checkered legacy of betrayals, the nonsensical lack of science, and the rampant falsehoods and distortions from the American medical industry, they have thoroughly discredited themselves. Ivermectin works. The medical field has lied and said that it does not. The vaccines have killed more people in 10 months than all other vaccines combined for the last 31 years. You don't hear that reported either, and you can verify that with VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS. That's where that statistic comes from. In fact, it's not even close, guys. The COVID vaccines have actually killed 50% more people in 10 months of widespread use, I guess close to 11 months now, than every other vaccine combined for the last 31 years. And it only goes back 31 years because that's how long they've been collecting data. The last point I want to make about the COVID deception is that the death counts have also been grotesquely inflated. The CDC has admitted that 94% of patients with COVID, notice I don't say they die from COVID, I say they die with COVID. 94% of those had pre-existing conditions, and the average age was over 80. And by the way, it's not that they're just healthy 80-year-olds with one pre-existing condition. No, they're 80-year-olds with an average of 2.6 pre-existing conditions. This is somebody who's 80 years old, who's already had a stroke. That's one pre-existing condition. They have high blood pressure. That's another. And maybe they have diabetes too. And this kind of profile actually does apply to 94% of the so-called COVID deaths. Only 6% of the so-called COVID deaths had COVID alone. The other 94% had comorbidities, pre-existing conditions, and therefore it really cannot be scientifically ascertained whether COVID itself killed them. Well, let me put this in simple terms. If only 6% of the cases were really caused by COVID alone, that means roughly 19 out of every 20 cases are deaths with COVID that were actually caused by other pre-existing conditions. So when you take the 750,000 deaths that are claimed to have been caused by COVID, you actually need to divide that by about 20 to get the real number. And when you do that, you'll see that there's been perhaps 40,000 deaths from COVID alone, which is still tragic, but it's on par with how many people the flu kills each year. So these are the points I want to sum up one more time. From lobotomies to thalidomide to sexual assault to everything else, we see that the medical business has a legacy of untrustworthy conduct. We cannot allow people with a manifest record of dishonesty to seize sovereignty over our bodies. No, we must retain bodily autonomy. My body, my choice, your body, your choice. That's what this is about. If you want to have access to these vaccines, even though they don't work and they're lethal injections and they'll probably harm you, by all means, go and let the doctor shoot you up and get as many boosters as you want, but don't force the rest of us to do it with you. If you really think that the vaccine works, you shouldn't care whether other people get it. Even Bill Gates admitted just a couple days ago, Bill Gates himself admitted that these vaccines do not prevent transmission. So because they can't keep you from spreading it, there's no public health benefit to mandating them, and the people who want to mandate them are totally untrustworthy anyway. That's my presentation. I'll now take questions from the independent media.
What's the most important thing that you think that people who have to take the vaccine should do?
Yes. Okay, pre-treat yourself with ivermectin. Now, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not providing medical advice, obviously. But yeah, let me put it this way. If I personally had no choice but to get the vaccine, I guess for me that would be if my family was going to starve and they were going to put me in jail anyway, and then once they put me in jail, they'll probably hold me down and inject me anyway. Okay, fine. At that point, you have to get it. So pre-treat with ivermectin.
Well, a lot of people are losing their jobs if they don't get vaccinated. So what do you want them to do?
Well, I can say in my business, I've had to give up clients, I've had to give up work because I'm not vaccinated. So I feel that pain. It's a sacrifice I've been able to make. If you can make that sacrifice to preserve the integrity of your body, I would commend you for that. But if not, here's what you can do. Pre-treat with ivermectin or with hydroxychloroquine, as that will help to mitigate the damage from the spike protein. Now, that's what I would do. I'm not actually telling you to do that. I'm not a doctor. I'll critique them, but I'm not a doctor myself. But that is how I would try to mitigate, either ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, and I would take some before getting the vaccine, and I would take it until after getting the vaccine, until I felt normal again.
What's the most important information you can give us about VAERS? The updated info about VAERS.
Thank you for that question, by the way.
VAERS is government funded, so this is not conspiracy theory. What does the government funded channel of VAERS say?
Well, so I want to start by addressing some of the misconceptions and complaints that people have raised against VAERS. I want to start there. The main complaint against VAERS is that the data are unverified, that clinicians submit the data, but then the HHS and the CDC, they don't necessarily go in and verify every submission. Point granted, but think of it this way. Every other vaccine in VAERS has also been measured in the same way. So when I compare the number of VAERS deaths from COVID vaccines to the number of VAERS deaths from other vaccines, whatever the problems with the VAERS numbers are, I'm comparing apples to apples. So let me put it this way. VAERS is a powerful tool to get a relative sense of which vaccines are more or less risky. VAERS does have limitations, and in fact, the limitation with VAERS is not over-reporting, it's under-reporting. We know from some of the Project Veritas whistleblower videos that staff at HHS-funded hospitals were actually pressured to reduce the number of VAERS submissions on the vaccines for the sake of maintaining the narrative of highly safe and highly effective. Remember that highly safe, highly effective, that has not been scientifically established, that is a narrative. So what VAERS does is it provides a way of gauging these vaccines for COVID compared to the rest. And listen to this, within just the last 2 weeks, so between October 15th and October 29th, and they lag a little bit with the data, so they're only up to October 29th for now. So just from October 15th to October 29th, the number of VAERS COVID vaccine deaths increased from 17,000 to more than 18,000. That's an increase of 500 vaccine deaths every week. There's no other vaccine that has ever even been close to that. This is totally unprecedented. And consider this one other thing. Because VAERS, it's a long and time-consuming form, and doctors and nurses are extremely busy, and they're being pressured not to complete it. So actually, knowledgeable experts estimate that VAERS only captures 1 to 10% of the adverse events. So rather than thinking, oh, this is unverified, it's probably exaggerated, no, that's not what the experts have always said. The experts say that VAERS is actually only 10% or less of the total. And there is a lawsuit in federal court in which the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, their data suggest that there have been 50,000 COVID vaccine fatalities, And so the 17 or 18,000 that we know of from VAERS, it's an important start. It tells us that these are more dangerous than every other vaccine combined, but there are those limitations that it's probably not even capturing the full extent.
VAERS is voluntary, correct?
And that's why it's not perfect, it's voluntary. So many doctors, many nurses, well actually it's a little different. So there is some form of an obligation for them to report, but just in practice, it's voluntary, because in practice there's all kinds of time pressures and political pressures for them not to report. So what I'm saying is, in effect, it might as well be a voluntary system, because even where there are policies in place to encourage or mandate reporting, those are being sloppily enforced or not enforced at all. So it's the Wild West. VAERS is the best source of data we have, but it's incomplete. And I'd be willing to bet, and experts have said, that it's probably a lot more fatalities, a lot more disabilities, a lot more devastating injuries than VAERS even shows.
VAERS.
And the best place to access that will be openvaers.com. OPENVAERS.com. That takes the government's data and presents it in a more user-friendly way. However, if you say, I don't want to go to a third party, you can also access VAERS directly at hhs.gov and see the exact numbers from the government. It's just a little harder to use.
What do we say to people when they say that we are behaving like any type of illegal group in the United States of America? What does that mean exactly?
Well, these days, the CEO of Pfizer, in just the last couple of weeks, he said that anybody who spreads so-called misinformation about vaccines is a criminal. And so some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world want to make it a crime to question. Now let's talk about that, guys. As soon as you're told you cannot question, you are no longer in the realm of science. You've entered the realm of religion. The whole point of science is that it is a process of inquiry through empiric observation. That means the use of the senses, use of measurements, gathering data, and investigating what's actually happening in reality, and constantly asking questions, constantly refining theories, constantly improving your models. That is what science is. As soon as you're told that you cannot question, it is not science, it is religion. And if it calls itself science, then it's a scam trying to manipulate you. So that's one way in which they are trying to get rid of dissent, by saying if you question science, you're a criminal. Another way they're doing it is by saying that people who believe in medical freedom are some kind of right-wing extremists, but that's a falsehood. This is a movement that unites everybody.
Robert Kennedy Jr. is not a Republican.
Exactly. From a Democrat like Robert Kennedy Jr. to a Republican like Rand Paul, because what do those people have in common? They are dissenters. They are willing to deviate from the consensus. A consensus that cannot be questioned is a dangerous consensus, and it shouldn't be allowed. Questioning strengthens ideas. It doesn't weaken them. And this idea that if you question, you're a terrorist, no, the ones saying that are the real terrorists. Because if they get their way and they crush our First Amendment and they make it impossible to dissent, we're going to enter a totalitarian terror state like the world has never seen.
Where does it say in the U.S. Constitution that you have freedom over your body?
Let's read that now. Let's take a look at our founding document, the most remarkable governmental document ever crafted by mankind, along with perhaps the Magna Carta.
Do you need a light?
I'm going to use this light. So the Fourth Amendment says, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Let me read that first part one more time. The right of the people to be secure in their persons. That means you, your body, you as you move through the world, your person. That right shall not be violated except upon probable cause with a warrant. So in terms of forced vaccination, forced medical treatment, the issue is that they're doing sick until proven healthy. We've never accepted that as a society. That's as backwards as doing guilty until proven innocent. And so that's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. We are secure in our persons. We don't have to show our papers to demonstrate that we've gotten medical treatments to our bodies, especially when there's no reasonable suspicion that we in particular are sick. So it is a total violation of the Fourth Amendment, and I hope the Supreme Court, when these mandate cases do reach it, will reach the same conclusion.
Do you believe that Biden's medical mandates are legal?
No. No, they're likely to be thrown out, and the Supreme Court will really show what it's made of, as I believe it's 18 or 19 governors and attorneys general from the states have asserted under the 10th Amendment. Now, this is another one I've got to read to you, the 10th Amendment, because along with the 4th Amendment, the 10th Amendment makes Biden's mandates illegal. Now, let's go ahead and read it. So, Amendment number 10 states, the powers not delegated to the United States, that means the federal government. So the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. It's right there in black and white. If the government has not explicitly been given a federal responsibility to do something, then that responsibility resides with the state governments and the people of those states. So there could be a case made for state-level mandates, but there can be no case made for federal mandates. Let me sum it up. In my estimation, federal mandates violate both the 4th and the 10th Amendments, while state mandates probably only violate the 4th Amendment. But they all violate the Constitution in at least one way, and often in multiple ways.
And what's the most important message that you have today after all the research that you do?
Yes.
You're my professor.
Well, here's my message. My message is, don't give in to fear. When something is marketed to you using fear, you're being manipulated. And this has consistently been the strategy of the federal government in partnership with corporations, to crank up the fear as much as they can until the spirit of the people is broken and we submit to whatever they want to do with us just because we hope it'll make the pain stop. Guys, I've got news for you. When you give in to the bully, it doesn't make the bully give away, or it doesn't make the bully go away. It makes the bully pick on you more. Furthermore, I think a lot of people, they sense the deep danger of allowing the government to dictate vaccines. Because if they can dictate vaccines, they can dictate whatever medical procedure they want. And that has some terrifying implications. I think people sense the danger, and because they feel like the battle is already lost, they feel like, well, I'd better just comply. But that's also terrible logic. Here's an analogy for that. If you put your head into the mouth of a lion, the lion is not going to pat you on the back, reward you for your loyalty, and let you go. No, the lion is a predator, and he's going to eat you first because you made it easy. The ones who are voluntarily getting the vaccine, they're putting their heads into the lion's mouth. They're making it easier. And if it's not the first shot or the second, it'll be the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Guys, the program that's being put into effect here is a shot every 6 months. Just how many of those do you think your body can take before permanent damage happens? So the message is, remain strong. And if you really can't, because maybe you've already taken some of the shots, or for whatever reason, the circumstances in your life, you feel forced to get the shot, look into ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine to possibly mitigate the spike protein which those vaccines cause your body to produce. So my message is, don't give in to fear. Don't think that if you give in to the bully, he's going to go away. We have to stand up to the bully, and it doesn't get easier. The more time that passes and the more entrenched the system gets, the harder it is to stand up. This Constitution, this document, is written in the blood of the Founding Fathers. And if we piss away, pardon me, but if we give away this republic that they died to give to us, think back to the words of Ben Franklin. He said, you have a republic if you can keep it. And he also said, those who would trade precious liberty for a little temporary security deserve neither. We must value the inheritance of our forefathers. This document is written in their blood. These rights, these prerogatives, these privileges, this is the law of the land, but we have to keep it that way.
Why are you meeting at the American Pharmacists Association, and why is the American Pharmacists Association on Constitution Avenue in front of the State Department, and why is the State Department right next to the Federal Reserve?
We see the entanglement of industry and government. They're all wrapped up together, and the people at the top have their hands in a lot of pockets, and they've accumulated so much wealth. When you look at the pandemic alone, it's been estimated by numerous reputable publications that there's been at least a $3.9 trillion transfer of wealth, the vast majority going to the top 1%. Think about it. Small businesses forced to close, large businesses allowed to remain open, and we see that with this juncture, this nexus of corporate power, industry power, government power, all accumulated together and turned against the people that it's supposed to serve.
How much money do you think was made since COVID-19 closures in March 2020 on the vaccination, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson stocks?
Oh, I can possibly answer that question. I know with Pfizer, they went from 50 billion to 80 billion. I know with Moderna, their stock has gone up by an order of magnitude. It's gone up by roughly a factor of 10. And I can tell you that at least 10 new vaccine billionaires have been created. By the way, that figure, the 10 new vaccine billionaires, that's from May of this year. It's probably more now. So it's uncountable billions of dollars, and by the end of this whole charade, I suspect it will be in the trillions, because it's not just the vaccines, by the way. It's the antibody treatments. Which, while the antibody treatments work better than the vaccines, it costs several $1,000s a treatment. So the amount of money that is just sluicing around when ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine work, according to doctors, I'm not saying this, I'm quoting Dr. Zelenko. I'm leaning on his experience. I'm not a doctor. Dr. Zelenko says that ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, zinc, azithromycin, he treated hundreds of patients, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, without one death. Not even Regeneron has that kind of track record. So we see that it's uncountable billions, possibly trillions, because treatments that cost thousands of dollars are being actively pushed beyond simple, widely available treatments that would be a fraction of the cost.
What do you think is the most important thing for every man watching, every woman watching this?
Well, I would say guard your children most of all. Really guard your children. If you're a man, as a father, or if you're an uncle, if you have boys who are in their teens or younger, and those are important family members in your life, you've got to prevent them from getting these shots. Because when you look at specifically the 12 to 17-year-old boys, it's been demonstrated in a study from the University of California that the risk of being killed or maimed, specifically with heart damage, the inflammation, the heart attacks, that is 3 to 6 times higher than the risk from COVID itself. And yet we see school districts mandating injections for boys and girls. The injections are more risky for the boys. They're not good for the girls either. So what I would say to every man and woman in this country, even if you're fully grown, even if you're willing to roll the dice on the vaccine, protect the children. Protect the children, because they don't have the agency to choose for themselves. It is you standing in the gap between a rapacious medical business, a potentially lethal injection, and the children who very soon, they've already gotten it down to as young as age 5. It's going to be as young as age 2. That just leaked in the news this week. You've got to protect your children. That's my message to every man and woman in this country.
Why do you care so much?
Well, I work in education. I work with numbers every day. I teach statistics. I know how to read numbers. And the massive statistical illiteracy that has led to people thinking there's a crisis when there's really not. Guys, I demonstrated to you earlier that rather than 750,000 deaths from COVID, it's more like 40,000 deaths from COVID, and that's rounding up, by the way. So if people just knew that, it would change the whole conversation. If people didn't see this fake 750,000 deaths, that alone would change minds and change hearts. So I have a passion to educate and to get the facts out there. I don't work in the medical field. I just know how to do math, and I know how to read statistics, and I know how to explain it. I'm doing this to protect especially the young people of this country, because I have a heart for the ones who can't defend themselves. That's why this presentation, my focus was really on 3 areas: pediatric, geriatric, psychiatric. Those are the 3 most vulnerable groups: the very young, the elderly, and the ones who are mentally ill. And I also talked about the abuses of women who have been marginalized as well at points in history. So I want to show that every single vulnerable group is being exploited, and I can't stand to see that. I'm able to do my own research. I'm able to see easily that this vaccine is bad, and I will keep explaining, and I will keep harping on this until the message gets out there so that others have that same freedom from fear. You don't need to fear COVID. Deaths with COVID is not an accurate metric. There's only been about 40,000 deaths from COVID, and that's no worse than the seasonal flu. People need to know that.
What happens if the coronavirus mutates and gets worse? What do we do then?
And that's what's happening with these so-called leaky vaccines. The vaccines only reduce the symptoms a little bit. They don't prevent the vaccine from reproducing, they don't prevent the virus from reproducing, and they don't prevent the virus from spreading. And because the vaccines fail to do that, they allow the virus to mutate. It's the same idea when you get a course of antibiotics, and the doctor and the pharmacist both remind you, you need to take every dose until the course of antibiotics is gone. This is because if you only partially finish those antibiotics, the very strongest bacteria will survive, they'll reproduce, and it'll actually worsen that disease. That's antibiotic-resistant bacteria. That same phenomenon is now happening with viruses with COVID, because that's how the Delta mutation came about. That's how all these other mutations, there's been dozens of strains, and those have been proliferating. As vaccine uptake increases, mutation will increase. That's not me saying that, that's Dr. Zelenko and many other medical experts. For those who want to learn more about how vaccines cause mutation, how they ultimately make the so-called pandemic worse, I encourage you to look up the Leaky Vaccine channel on Telegram. Probably if you do a search on Brave or DuckDuckGo or even Google, but I would do Brave search, and if you type in Leaky Vaccine Telegram, it's going to take you to the channel where I'm getting my information, and it's reproducing from actual medical experts. You shouldn't take my word for it. You should dig into the facts yourself.
Last question, what's the end game financially?
Well, we know that Pfizer's already sucked in $30 billion. In fact, it's $33.5 billion of revenue from the vaccine alone. Pfizer has now rolled out a COVID pill that's going to cost $700 for a course of treatment. This is several times more expensive than ivermectin, which would work just as well. I don't think there is a financial endgame. I think that they will rapaciously accumulate, avariciously gobble up as many resources as we allow them to. This is an attempted conquest of the world by the American medical business. They've gotten farther than I ever thought they would. If we put our feet down, if we refuse to submit to the vaccines, if we refuse to submit to experimental treatments, perhaps a lack of financial profitability will slow them down. I think it's more than money. I think it's also about power and control, in addition to consolidating wealth. And I think their end game is to have total control over our bodies, and through vaccine passports to control who is able to participate in society. And this is the medical field we're talking about. These aren't even elected officials. We've got to stand up. We've got to put our foot down. So I'll just say it one more time. I don't think there's an end game. I don't think this ever ends unless we stand up and stop it.
How do we stand up and say, my body, my choice, your body, your choice?
Well, one way is you can go to 1776today.us. I'm going to continue putting out content about fighting mandates. We just won some big victories in Virginia in terms of a candidate who is against the mandates, and I'm not getting political. That was my one issue I voted on. I'll vote for whoever's against the mandates. So that's what I encourage people to do. Vote for whoever's against the mandate. follow actual news, which you can get from me at 1776today.us. You can get it from independent media like Corinne IRL. You can get it from the Leaky Vaccine Telegram channel. You can get it from Vax Watch. That's another one. It's VAX Watch. That's also on Telegram. So really, vote for the anti-mandate candidates and get on Telegram. You're going to find a whole world of information that doesn't get reported in the news, but information based on peer-reviewed sources. Here's an example of that. You know what I just learned today? All of these European countries in the last week have been limiting Moderna or Pfizer or both. Different countries have said, some countries have said, we won't let people under 30 get Moderna. And then another country today announced that they won't let people under 30 get Pfizer. And the names of those countries, they're slipping my mind, but I'll add it to the notes for the show. So think about that. Other countries that have more functioning governments, whereas America's government is totally corrupt, these European countries that still have some vested...
Wait, if our country's totally corrupt, what do you want us to do? Newsflash! We're in front of the American Pharmacy Association. Behind it is the State Department. Wait, if America's totally corrupt, if our government, if the federal government's totally corrupt, what do you want us to do?
I think we should march and call out the corruption right now.
I'm a journalist. I'll follow whatever you guys choose to do. We need more people in Washington, D.C. who are willing to stand up for freedom.
Yes. All right. We're going to march for freedom right now.
We're on Constitution Avenue. Sorry, it's been very noisy. Biden is flying in and out of Washington, D.C., so it's very noisy. My body, my choice, your body, your choice. What's up to all y'all? I'm in Washington, D.C. This is my professor. He's on Rumble, 1776 Space Today, 1776today.us. That's my professor. And we're in front of the State Department, and that is the U.S. Museum of Peace, and this is the American Pharmacists Association, and the American Medical Association is secretly behind there, and everything's just such a secret. What are they hiding? What are they hiding from us in the United States of America? That's Constitution Avenue. That's the Lincoln Monument. That is the U.S. for peace. I mean, it's the nicest real estate I've ever seen. Is there peace? Seems like there's peace, but there might not be. I just don't know. But is there peace over your body, your spirit, your soul?
A lot of money going toward peace, but we don't see a lot of peace in the world.
Where's all the money going? I was at the State Department and I met a lot of people who were involved in, can't even say it. Should I tell you guys the truth? What's the point? Should I tell you the truth about everything, every single day? What's going on? It's all about money. We're only going to heal when it's not just all about money anymore.
Show us the money.
It's got to be about humanity. It's got to be about, I care about you, please care about me. It's got to be about humanity. How do we get back to humanity? How do we get back to caring about each other? How do we get back to a federal government that respects our right to freedom? Yes.
It's got to be the Lord Jesus Christ. He's the only one who's going to save us now. That's the other thing. In addition to voting, people pray. Praying is far more important than voting.
Pray to the goodness. May we all be united, not divided.
Yes. Absolutely. And take a look at Psalm 139 sometime, and that'll describe the proper way to regard the American medical business. And I'll leave it at that for now. But take a look at Psalm 139 and pray that over our current situation.
My body, my choice.